and welcome back to Razmafzar TV. I have Professor Sharifi back on our channel. I'm really honored to greet him and to have him on our channel. Hi.
Hi, good afternoon.
Nice to see you. And so today we are going to talk about Monroe Doctrine and also compare it to this so-called Donroe Doctrine or policy, whatever. And I would really like, because Professor Sharifi is an expert in this area, I would like to, so he explains to us, first of all, what is Monroe Doctrine? And then based on that, nowadays, more and more people are talking about Donroe. Let's talk about the definition first, and then we can go about the consequences or different parts of each doctrine or policy. Okay, Majid, go ahead, please.
Yes, Monroe was the Foreign Secretary of the state back in 1820s, and that was the time that actually the United States was an isolationistic policy in the sense that it wanted to be disentangling itself from European great power politics and focus on the continent itself. And at the time, the idea was that we don't want to be involved with what France and UK and Holland at the time or other imperial countries, colonizing countries were doing. Russia, it was the emergence of Russia again and Ottoman Empire. What they were doing, not getting politics with them, disentangled from them and focus on the region of Americas, namely the continent of the United States or the continent of America, North America, and also Latin America. So he came with Monroe Doctrine, and the idea that we are not interested in Europe or Asia, they never were, not at the time, or Middle East, which even the name didn't exist at the time. But we are only interested in this hemisphere, the Americas hemisphere, this Western hemisphere. And of course, at the time, the very idea of hemispheric or spheres of influence was important because at the time, all of the colonial powers had drawn their own spheres of power, meaning that this is mine, this is my colony, and they had some sort of agreement with each other to actually plunder and exploit and extract resources from these countries without interference from each other. So it was like a gang of mafia colonizing countries, colonizing Africa and the Middle East and the East. And they were in concert with each other. And they were in sort of concert that they call concert of peace that started from 1815 after Napoleon War in Britain. And in this concept of peace, it was the idea that they actually lived together peacefully in Europe, in a sense. But then they divide the world and they just compete for dividing the world among themselves. So it was in that context that Monroe Doctrine came, and it really wasn't much of anything because at the time, so many of these countries in Latin America were actually getting their independence from Spain and Portugal in that era of the 1800s. And US didn't have that much influence. US became very, very powerful and became a regional power after Civil War of 1860s. And then by the time we get to Teddy Roosevelt, US is a naval power, almost a global power, but still doesn't want to get involved with Europe. And they're not involved in Europe or any other place. And it is at that time that they want to expand outward. And so the Monroe Doctrine, Teddy Roosevelt, add to it, they call it corollary to Monroe Doctrine, which is adding to it. At that time, they said that we're going to protect our interest by military means if anyone interferes, or if there are social revolutions or other things. So military means became a part and parcel of that doctrine, corollary to Monroe Doctrine, and that continued until today. During the 1900s, many, many times, of course, U.S. has violently interfered with the affairs of South America and Latin America. And there's hundreds of cases of that interference, overt and covert, violently through coups, regime change, takeovers, and name it, they've done it. And of course, that started with the idea of Teddy Roosevelt wanting to create and build this Panama Canal. And of course, Panama didn't exist. So it was a part of Colombia, today's Colombia, and Colombia didn't agree to give this parcel of land to the United States. So the United States just took it over and created a country called Panama. And that country is pretty much U.S. colony, was, is, and probably will be for a while. So they made the canal after that, and it's been continuing. Now, I think with globalization, things a little bit change after 1990s, and the idea was free competition or free market competition because U.S. many people in U.S. pushed the idea of globalization, of bringing down kind of borders. It was a U.S. push,
Yes.
a whole lot. And of course, now after 30 years, that project is falling apart because US can't compete.
Yes.
They can't compete in the free marketplace or so-called free marketplace. It was never free to begin with. It was always free for very powerful countries, great powers. And since 10 years ago or so, and now they're losing to China. And now
Yes.
that they're losing to China in every which way, so they want to bring it back. They no longer free traders, and Donald Trump is actually symbolizes that kind of movement away from globalization, and move to going back to military occupation and creating spheres of influence because it cannot compete with the rest of the world,
This
as,
monetary
namely
theory.
China. So this is called, he called it Donroe Doctrine, but it's actually going back to really days of military influence, which is a fantastic failure because it's not going to work. It
I have
didn't
some
work
questions.
before. It didn't work before. It's not going to work now.
I have some questions. When you mention like this military intervention and globalization, is this globalization, was it also pushed by Friedman theory, free markets, like Milton Friedman, who always pushed as an economist, as an American economist, that markets regulate themselves, the business of business is business? Is it in that line that back then US was pushing it, that free markets globally, like Friedman theory, shareholder value, in contrast to this nowadays we talk about stakeholder value? Is it also in line with that kind of theory?
Definitely, definitely. Of course, it wasn't only Friedman, and of course, it was Hayek and the theory of now they call it classical liberalism. It was around. That was the first 100 years of capitalist, liberal capitalism. The whole idea of free market has to work, and now free market is not only domestic but also international. And yes, it is Friedman that really pushed that. The idea actually went a little bit further than liberalism. It became what is called new liberalism, which meaning that everything that the state did before as public goods. So in economics, we have two type of goods. We have private goods and public goods. Private goods are things that are owned by private owners and they are exchangeable in the market. But and in classical liberalism, the argument is there are some goods that cannot be private because private market or free market cannot really handle it. For example, having bridges, prison, police, military, in some countries, healthcare. or whatnot. These are the things that private market doesn't make money in it. You need a lot of investment for the long term, and you need you need not to work based on free market practices. So public goods has been a part and parcel of liberalism, Smithian, Ricardoian liberalism, the idea that, let's say, police and military and the state itself are public goods. There are services that the government has to provide because the free market fails in providing them. Example of, let's say, healthcare insurance and things like that. And then comes Friedman and the rise of globalism. They say the state is too big, public goods is not functioning, it's not efficient. Let's just tax people and give those and have private companies actually provide those services. So we're talking about, let's say, privatized military, privatized police, privatized. I'm really serious about privatized military. So many of the things that right now military does, it's not really the military is not doing it. It's private contractors that have been subcontracting out. And this theory went over everything, including school, privatization of school, public schools, and all that. It's not like people don't get taxes, but it is run based on corporatism. And now it has come to an end, that too, in ways because it has failed. So yes, it is. Globalization was about that, but U.S. thought that because it has the largest capital, it can control the biggest share of the global market, and through its capital and informations and services that it provides, it can keep up its GDP. And for a while, for about 30 years or so, it really worked because China and South Asian countries provided cheap goods to European economies and American economies. And of course, American economy was very profitable. They were able to invest in new technologies and things like that. But China and many other countries have overreached that. Now they're actually making things that are really high tech, high profit, from EV to computer to chips to things like that. So it's falling apart. So the share of GDP as far as the global level is concerned, like in 1960, 65% of global GDP was the United States. I may be wrong on the numbers a little bit, but right now it's not. Actually, in terms of weight and number of customers and tonnage and all things like that, China is bigger.
Yes.
And if you compare the global South actually produces more than Global North. Global North has a lot of, in terms of value, in terms of exchange, in terms of, let's say, currency, it has a huge value. But in terms of tonnages, services, products, and things like that, it's almost very little because so much of this is in the service sector of banking,
Yes.
insurance, capital interest, information control, computer, and many uh, highly exploitative copyrights and things like that. So exploitative, non-productive, and leechy type of production, and it's catching up. It's catching up now. People and the whole system of what's called new liberal US led new liberal internationalism, which was established by the United States based on rules of the United States and what was in the interest of the United States and its European allies, is falling apart. It's collapsing on its own weight. Of course, they're blaming China and Russia and Iran and the rest of the countries, but it's actually their own doing. Now they have to adjust, they must adjust, and out of this monstrous time, of course, in this adjustment, it can become very, very violent, like Venezuela or Iran or Greenland or things like that. So if you're talking about Donroe Doctrine, linking it to the economic production of the country, it it is actually a sign of the failure of new liberalism and liberal economic theories and practices of the West. And Europe has become irrelevant. US has become wounded, wounded, and this disease is not going to be going away because you can't bring back productivity overnight.
Professor Sharifi, some years ago, to my surprise, and we teach it, of course, I mean, we teach it also at our university, talking about CSR, corporate social responsibility. I just have one question because you are into geostrategy. Interesting thing for me was always why all of a sudden we are pushing for corporate social responsibility where monetarism looked down at it, right? Now we said, okay, corporations should have CSR. And one of the reasons they talk about it is that the new generation, masses of them, the so-called generation XYZ, they are much more ethical than we were, right? So that's the reason there is a push as a response we are doing CSR. Is CSR really response to the demands of the masses, or is CSR a construct that we are having it as a strategic tool to respond to these changes worldwide?
Well, you know, I got to give you a little bit background on this one because liberal capitalism has always been hypocritical. It has always been democracy inside, free market inside, but of course, extraction, exploitation, plunder for the outside. So that was very, very obvious. So free economic policies for us, but then domination, extractions, and corruption outside. Democracy was pretty much the same thing. Democracy for us among the elites, liberal elites in the West, but for third world countries and colonized countries, including Iran, to have a monarch, our handpicked monarchs, coup leaders, dictators, and all that. And they loved it, unless those dictators became anti America, anti Europe. So, in that sense, it was always performative, it was always showy, it was always hypocrisy by intention and by purpose. They meant to be democratic, but they were never democratic like for the rest of the world. How could you have parliamentarian democracy, let's say in British colonizing country, and then of course colonize all of India or Africa, or try to colonize Iran? So these things are hypocrisy by design. But now, after World War II, US actually, because of the Soviet Union and the Cold War, the whole idea of US liberal internationalism was that we're going to have UN, we're going to have a bunch of international law, and we're going to respect sovereignty of other countries. And of course, even in during that time, as we know, during the Shah's time or Allende or hundreds of other examples, US was really performing somewhat, sticking to some of the international laws, but not all of them.
Yes.
And US was the same. It was pretending to be democracy, but then the black vote didn't matter, the Hispanic vote didn't matter, the minority didn't matter. Any other party could not come. It was a duopoly and dual. And the same thing in Britain, the same thing in Germany. But they went along. They went along, performed democracy, a fake democracy inside and no democracy outside. But during that time, during the Cold War and afterward, human rights and promoting democracy became really real, in a sense, performing it, like going to war against many of these countries like Iraq to bring democracy to them. So you see the hypocrisy of it again. They never wanted it. They didn't mean to bring or take democracy there. Democracy cannot be done by another country. The same thing with free economic enterprises, because it was all monopolistic, manipulating, and extraction and exploitation. So now I made the story too long, perhaps, but the point is here when you're talking about corporate responsibility. During the globalization, because corporations became stronger than the states
Yes.
in some countries, and like Azerbaijan or in many of these countries. So now performing democracy was supposed to be done through these corporations. So the phrase corporate responsibility from the very beginning has always been fake, phony, hypocritical propaganda, because the only responsibility corporations have is to their stockholders, and the stockholders are not the whole nation or some. There are very few. There are 1,000 or 1% of the population in the United States. We're not talking about little corporations like middle class or whatnot. We're not talking about them. We're talking about corporations that are running the world and America and Europe. And in this sense, they came up with this performative idea of corporate responsibility. They were never the same way that democracy didn't mean anything but a performance, but a show, but a theater. And the same thing was with corporate responsibility. There were no corporate responsibility. How could you possibly have Chevron or Exxon or these countries to be responsible while they're polluting the air for the whole for generations to come, and they have done it for generations in the past, and then you ask them, in fact, to be also responsible for the environment? In propaganda and advertising and commercial, that's exactly true. So on that, I'm going to just give you one example of Chevron. Chevron is a fossil fuel energy company, and in their advertising they say that we are all about human energy. Bullshit. You're not about human energy. You kill people in Nigeria and other places. You pollute the air and the water and the forest and all that. And how could you be about you're about fossil fuel, but it tells its audiences and paid millions of dollars in advertising that we are about human energy. Or Exxon advertises or BP advertises as we are environmentally concerned. How? It's all words, empty. There is no practice. It's only advertising and propaganda. So there is no such a thing as corporate responsibility. Corporate responsibility could only happen if these corporations were forced to actually do all of the externality costs that they have created. So many of them, so much of them, especially in the case of environmental things. So that I don't believe it. It has never been. It's been always empty words, and it's just advertising. That's all. It's nothing. Empty words.
Okay. Coming back to Donroe Doctrine, and so USA, as we know, has the strongest military in the world, right? At least we read it, right? And the, if they maintain their strengths, if United States can, or if or maintains its strengths, it can apply Donroe policies or doctrine almost everywhere. Am I correct?
No, I'm sorry to say that, no, because we have to qualify what the strength is. You are so totally correct that US has the biggest, largest, most fatal, most destructive military in the world. But let's just kind of break that down. Yes, US has the power to actually bomb everywhere and kind of, kill the earth as we know it.
Yes.
Yes, it has that destructive power. It has, for example, has the destructive power to bomb Iran to stone ages and kill all of the population or half of it or one quarter of it, whatever they design. The same thing, they do have that power. They had that power in Afghanistan and Iraq and Venezuela and all that. But what does that mean? The purpose for, under this system, the purpose for destroying something is to just go ahead and remake it in your own image, to make it to be profitable and beneficial to you. That's not the same thing. In fact, US military is so weak when it comes to its achieving its political purposes. It cannot achieve its political purposes because political purposes are not, one dimension of it is taking over and destroying some places, but it's not everything. We saw that in Afghanistan and in
Yes.
Iraq, in
Yes.
Syria, in Libya,
Yes.
in Iran,
Yes.
and Israel, which is very destructive military, very powerful. They can't even manage their own damn country because destruction does not mean construction. You can destroy easily, but you can't rule. Ruling needs consensus, legitimacy. And if the legitimacy doesn't come from the ground up, it will never work. You need 4 policemen for every citizen, and that's
Yes.
costly. And that's why I say colonialism failed. Remember, colonialism was a very coercive
Yes.
means of extraction,
Yes.
and it benefited Britain in India, at least, for example, for 300 years, over 300 years. But it became so expensive that it wasn't paying for itself. The
Yes.
reason that we became decolonized and independence and US became so powerful because they realized that colonizing other countries and controlling them and policing them and running their country is not profitable because it costs more money than you could extract.
Yes. True.
So Donroe Doctrine is an idiotic doctrine that thinking that they're going to come and run Venezuela and they're going to make profit. That's not going to happen. That's why they didn't even change the regime. They only kidnapped the leader. They haven't even changed the leadership.
May
This is
I ask you
crazy.
your expertise on it because it's a big mystery to me. How did they make it? Why didn't the Venezuelan army put any resistance? I mean, we
It,
hear they use special weapons. I seriously, this is the first
yes,
question I have from you.
it's
And
a good question.
the second question, Professor Sharif, why did Maduro choose to have bodyguards who were Cubans? Why not from his own country?
Well, I think Maduro is, first of all, very weak regime, lots of opposition, and there are lots of problem with Maduro. You're never gonna hear me worship him or whatnot. But because of safety issue, it's sometimes good to have detached guards. And Cuban military system as trainers, they've done really good, and they have done work for other countries too. And pretty much like most of the countries have, let's say, US military advisors. So allies do help each other to to have military advisors and trainers for security purposes, and separation and check and balances insofar as security of the president and key leaders. It happens, and it's not so unusual. Remember that the police departments in the United States and also in Germany and many other countries, they go to Israel to get trained.
Yes.
so so these connections, military connections and interdependence do exist for everyone, and for Maduro it exists, but it wasn't the reason that Maduro was a weak regime. And what they did, this kidnapping, was obviously a very destructive regime. They had lots of spies there, and it was brutal, and it was useless.